Thank you, everybody, for coming again. And of course, thank you for Alice for coming all this way. Just in a general introduction, those of you who have come to some of the other talks, I'm a little bit repeating myself, but clearly this exhibition and these dialogues are a little bit of a diversion from our normal agenda of territorial concerns. On the other hand, we've tried to think about what role design can play in Galicia and within this context. It sort of has to be said again, and it's clearly it's one of our positions in the foundation, that the role of architecture and design over the last 50 years has been has been greatly distracted from a sort of post-war and even pre-war attitude of social purpose. If you think about Bauhaus and then you think about housing projects of post-war Europe, one would have to say that if we went back 50 years or so, both architecture and design seem to be slightly more focused on social purpose. And in the intervening years, with the financialization of our world and the liberal economy that we have, one would have to say that all activities have been, let's say, contaminated by this mood, and design and architecture has been very much influenced by that, by the fact that there has been less activity and responsibility, let's say, from the public sector. We certainly have that in the Anglo-Saxon world, post-Thatcher, but also a much more vibrant private sector and, let's say, consumerist world. So design has certainly been directed by that. Many commentators over the last years have questioned how we should become, both as architects, planners, and designers, more useful. Not just useful to the market, but useful to society. And clearly, the Fundación RIA is, we're 20 architects who are, in a way, applying ourselves, hopefully, to trying to become slightly more useful in terms of our focus. It's clearly our central purpose. Alice has, for many years, challenged the conventional structures of the design world, which is very much Milan-based products, objects for the market. I mentioned last time our mutual friend, Dejan Sujic, famously not so long ago said, does the world need any more sofas or armchairs? And of course, to some degree, the design world has kept itself busy by redesigning chairs and things that you could argue we have enough. Alice has, I think, consistently challenged that orthodoxy, not by, in a way, Alice, I'm saying things I hope you don't disagree with. I don't think you dismiss the importance of objects, the importance of beautiful things that we have, but I think you've tried to make the design community think about design not just as something focused on the production of conventional products, but, as you say, as an attitude. And so Alice will give us a talk about her position, and then we'll have a small chat, and then we'll have questions and hopefully a discussion.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you, Celeste, for the lovely introduction. And thank you, Evelyn, and the team at Fondazione RIA for inviting me here to talk to you tonight. And thank you to all of you for being here. Now, when most people think of design, it's of a snazzy sofa, an overpriced hoodie, or a blingy phone. And design has, of course, contributed to all of the above, and will doubtless continue to do so, as David has pointed out. But I believe there is much, much more to it, and I'm going to try and convince you that that's the case. Now, design is a complex and elusive phenomenon. It's adopted many different meanings at different times and in different contexts. Yet in all its guises, I believe that design has one elemental role, and that's as an agent of change that interprets changes of any type, whether they're social, political, economic, scientific, ecological, technological, or whatever, to ensure that they will affect us positively rather than negatively. So my book, Design as an Attitude, here is the Spanish edition. Whoop, there it is. Describes how a new generation of designers are wrestling with those challenges by helping us to address complex issues from the deepening ecological and refugee crises to growing distrust of democracy and justice systems, the conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, Lebanon, Sudan, and tragically so many other places. And by doing so, they're fulfilling the vision of one of my design heroes. I have many design heroines, but in the spirit of gender equality, heroes too, and that is the remarkable Bauhaus teacher Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who summed up his vision of design with this: designing is not a profession, but an attitude. And he wrote that in 1946, just before he died. Now, not that this concept was new, because design existed long, millennia, not just centuries, before a word was invented to describe it. But for all that time, it was generally practiced unknowingly and instinctively. Because whenever human beings have adapted to changes in their lives, whether by making new objects or structures, moderating their own behavior or other people's, they've acted as designers, but they have done so intuitively and mostly unknowingly. So during the Industrial Revolution, the design process was applied knowingly and systematically to manufacture huge quantities of goods of consistent quality. So this really was a landmark change in design culture, the purpose and practice of design. And design was formalized with new training programs and specialist schools opening. It became professionalized, but I believe it was in this period that it was restricted to a commercial role, one that was generally executed under instruction by someone else. And for me, this was the beginning of design's diminution and its stereotyping as a PR or styling tool. But I believe that design is now returning to its original instinctive and improvisational guise, thanks to the plethora of digital tools that have transformed the practice and possibilities of design. Now, most of these tools, when they're imaginatively applied, have already proved remarkably useful in enabling designers to operate independently, making them free to pursue their social, political, ecological, or entrepreneurial objectives rather than working under instruction. And most of these digital tools are very simple. They're relatively inexpensive, and they're things that we encounter every day, so much so they can seem banal. Designers can, and indeed are, raising a lot of money from crowdfunding. They can now manage huge quantities of complex data on affordable computers and use social media to raise awareness of their work, flush out collaborators, suppliers, and fabricators, and to secure more funding. They also benefit from the growing interest from other sectors in forging design collaborations. And one example of this is the rapidly expanding phenomenon of legal design. Individually, each of these changes would have had a positive impact on design culture, as they have on so many other sectors, but collectively they've been transformational. Now, there are lots of examples in Designers and Attitude and on Design Emergency, the podcast and research platform that I run with my friend Paola Antonelli, Senior Curator of Architecture and Design at MoMA in New York, in which we interview the global design leaders who are at the forefront of addressing our complex intersectional problems at this tumultuous time of extreme uncertainty. And our next interview, which will be conducted by Paola, will be David's great friend, Francis Carré, followed by David himself, and he'll be interviewed by me. So now I'm going to discuss some practical examples of how designers are putting this new vision of design into practice to tackle the major challenges that face us. So in this terrifying and tragic time of increased global warfare, let's begin with conflicts. And design has proved absolutely crucial in the defense of Ukraine after Vladimir Putin's illegal and heinous full-scale invasion. He expected Ukraine to crumble after 3 days, and the rest of the world may have given it weeks or months, but Ukraine's defeat at the hands of the mighty Russian army was seen as highly probable. Now, the courage of the Ukrainian people and their determination not to succumb have been huge factors in their success in repelling the Russian invaders so far. But also, design has proved absolutely critical in Ukraine's defense because of the work of its tech and industrial designers in developing ever more powerful and precise drones, which, as The Economist put it, has rewritten the rules of modern warfare. Equally ingenious are these. These are, this is one of 70 1980s railway carriages, all out of commission, that have been converted into mobile ambulances, hospital wards, and even intensive care units by Ukrainian Railways design engineers and a design team assembled by the non-profit Kolo Foundation. These carriages have already transferred over 60,000 wounded Ukrainian soldiers out of the danger of battle zones and taken them to the specialist hospitals that can give them treatment in different parts and safer areas of Ukraine. And the new focus is on the design and construction of a network of underground military hospitals along the front line. By being underground, it of course makes it much, much, much more difficult, if not impossible, for the Russians to bomb them. While in Gaza, the designers and doctors at the NGO Médecins Sans Frontières have created bespoke refugee camps to provide emergency shelter to displaced people with disabilities, like this guy, who are, of course, exceptionally vulnerable in war zones. This camp in Al-Mawazi was designed with bespoke toilets and showers, wider doorways, lots of grab rails, and non-slip surfaces for up to 400 people with disabilities. I mean, this was a very fast-paced, pragmatic form of design reinvention, but a stunningly ingenious and effective one. Now, I haven't been able to verify this, but this very special camp, the product of so much thoughtfulness and sensitivity by its designers, has almost certainly been destroyed by Netanyahu's Israeli forces in the recent bombardment of Al-Mawazi. Now, on to the climate emergency, another of the massive challenges that faces us, and our ever freakier weather is, of course, a constant reminder of the extreme urgency of preventing the climate crisis from becoming a catastrophe. We know that we need to address this and that we need to do so soon and at scale. Now, there are two key areas of design where this is already happening. One is in the generation of clean energy, which continues to rise well above expectations. The other is in flood defenses, where ingenious design advances are already making a major impact to protect vulnerable areas. And one example is in China, where the pioneering landscape architect Kong Jian-yu designed parks, wetlands, and other green infrastructure to absorb, store, and purify floodwater in what he called sponge cities. Now, tragically, Yu died in a plane crash in September at the age of 62, but his important work is being continued not only in China, but elsewhere too by his team at Terrenscape in Beijing. Now, similar strategies are also being used in the Netherlands, which is forsaking concrete dikes, known as grey infrastructure, in favour of traditional natural flood defences by enabling floodwater to flow freely, the same principle as sponge cities, and to be absorbed into the land in its Room for the River programme. Now, the next major challenge is design's new role as a force for social justice, thanks to open source intelligence, or OSINT, which includes phone photos, video clips, CCTV footage, Find My apps, Google traffic data, and other visual evidence that's been gathered by civilians to establish the truth about humanitarian abuses and climate crimes. Now, OSINT has already transformed design practice in recent years, thanks largely to forensic architecture, an investigative design research agency based at Goldsmiths University in London. And it's dedicated to establishing the truth about disasters and abuses of power, from police brutality to climate crimes, like this devastating fire in 2024 at a petrol refinery in Indiana. The refinery claimed that local people were not affected by the fire, but thanks to these phone photos that they took from their gardens, you can see how damaging to air quality and so on it was. Now, forensic architecture assembles multidisciplinary teams to use OSINT to identify evidence to expose criminality and negligence in legal cases and policy reviews, as do other agencies pursuing similar objectives, like Menomic in Berlin and Killing Architects in Amsterdam. But conversely, specialists from other fields are increasingly using design as a crucial tool in their work. Take the Pakistani doctors, Zara Karam, who you can see in the beautiful yellow and turquoise sari to the left of the screen, and Ifat Safar, who have designed and delivered a national telemedicine service throughout Pakistan. It's called Sehat Kahani, which means the story of health in Urdu. Now, Pakistan is a country of 200 million people, half of whom don't have access to healthcare, and this affects women much more adversely than men. It was founded in 2017 after Sarah and Ifat, who'd studied medicine and qualified together, had both married and begun their families, so had stopped work to care for their children. And they decided to try and find a way to enable married women doctors like themselves, doctor brides as they're called, to treat female patients remotely from their homes using video consultations in areas of poor medical provision. They realized from the start that design would be a critical part of the project, so their first step was to attend a course of design classes that was run by one of their major donors, the Nike Foundation. A decade later, Sehat Kahani has over 2 million patients and has completed 1.1 million consultations last year alone, and is a role model for telemedicine worldwide. It's a fantastically inspiring example of a project in the global south that is heavily influencing similar work in the global north. Now, I believe that design is a powerful tool that can help us to tackle complex challenges from healthcare shortages and the climate crisis, but only, and it's a big only, if it is used intelligently, sensitively, and with extreme care and precision in collaboration with other relevant disciplines. Otherwise, how can design possibly hope to win the public confidence and political support that it needs to be empowered to play a more prominent role in our lives? It can't, not least because as designers become more ambitious, the consequences of failure escalate, as illustrated by a brilliant project by the Dutch architect Jan Willem Petersen. So Jan founded Specialist Operations, an investigative design research agency in Amsterdam, after he completed his master's degree in architecture in London in 2015. And it consisted of one person, himself, but had this very grand, rather dashing name. And he began by assessing the efficacy of this. This is called Task Force Rawsthorn, and it's an ambitious Dutch government-funded post-conflict reconstruction program in Afghanistan, and it was completed just before the Taliban's recent return to power. The project built new schools, clinics, roads, police stations, mosques, factories, even an airport in Rawsthorn, a desolate region stricken by decades of warfare. And Jan studied local dialects so he could travel around the region to analyse whether all this new infrastructure was fit for purpose. And he discovered that only 20% of it actually was. That 30% was so useless that it had already been abandoned, and the other 50% had such serious flaws that it could soon be abandoned too. This is one of 3 schools that was built in a very small Rawsthorn village, which had too few children to fill the schools, and so they were abandoned halfway through construction. The village still doesn't have a school because the Western designers didn't do their research properly. Now, Jan used his specialist knowledge and his knowledge of design to spot the flaws in all these projects and to suggest ways of avoiding repetitions in the future. He presented a 300-page report of his findings to the Dutch government and is now advising the Dutch Army, the Dutch Royal Military Academy, NATO, UN Habitat, and many other institutions on how to improve the design of post-conflict reconstruction programs like Task Force Rawsthorn in future. Now, his investigative design exercise demonstrates why designers must take the greatest possible care when working in such fragile situations. To him, it was blindingly obvious that the designers behind Task Force Rawsthorn simply hadn't bothered to investigate the area. Most of them had never even bothered to visit it. So no wonder they made these fundamental errors, wasting money and leaving these fragile communities without resources. But Jan also realised how highly valued at the most senior level of politics and diplomacy work like his can be in demonstrating design's value in addressing the complex intersectional challenges of this otherwise terrifyingly turbulent time. Thank you for listening. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Alice. You've identified a number of places where people have intervened very precisely with solutions to particular things. Most of them are emergencies, as you use, how do we apply, how do we convince our society that things which are not so explicitly can be so explicitly identified as these, frontline Ukrainian or Afghanistan, but let's say housing shortage in the UK, or other environmental things. Things that we're dealing with in this community, which we would say are emergencies, but they don't look like emergencies in the same way. How can we, in a way, create the same performance requirements? Or how can we clarify the need to intervene and address things which are not quite so explicit in their their emergency, in their priority?
Well, I think some of the examples I used, because I deliberately picked a wide range of them, do address that. So Sehat Kahani would be a good example of that. The provision of healthcare in Pakistan, urgently need by the country, no argument with that, but actually initially very controversially because they're two women. You know, they were doctor brides, they'd been good girls, they'd qualified as doctors, they gave up their careers when they first married and had children, but then first of all, they missed being needed, contributing to the medical service that they really believed in and helping their fellow citizens. And so they designed a solution to it, which I think everyone can understand the value of. Kong Jian Yu's Sponge Cities, similarly, or the Netherlands' Room for the River programme. I mean, they were the biggest champions of grey infrastructure for decades. You can drive through the Netherlands and you just see grey concrete wall after grey concrete wall. They have realised that it's not fit for purpose and it needed radically redesigning. So I think that my very small role in this, given that I've designed nothing, is to try and identify the people who are at the forefront of developing smart, sensitive, relevant design solutions to these huge problems and trying to, and by using their examples, make a case for why it's so important. And that is happening more and more. When I first started investigating this terrain, the sort of conservative part of the design community, particularly in the UK, was incredibly sceptical. Now people aren't.
No, I mean, what's great is that you're shaking up the conventional notion of what is sort of design territory and opening those borders up. And in a way, still, I mean, I think all designers have always felt that design is a problem-based issue. You know, we are, as designers, we're trying to solve a problem.
Or develop opportunities.
Yes, but those opportunities, you know, are often commercial or whatever, and often the problem is a slightly invented one, you know, a technical one or whatever. So my question is, in a way, how do we, you know, how do we state the problem? I mean, it's clear that the problem is explicit in terms of a case of flooding, in terms of national emergencies or whatever. But what about the problem of, I mean, we have in this community, let's say, of forest fires, or the abandonment of villages, or the proliferation of traffic in the middle of towns. We see that as a problem. It is a problem. And in many ways, they're problems that stack up to bigger issues. But they don't come so clearly with problem written all over them, you know, and that's where I think we have to try to work out as architects, planners, designers, that the approach you're advocating, which is one of saying, you know, scratch your head and think about things in a wider way, that that we need to intervene in issues which will improve people's lives in a much more general way than concluding with an object or concluding with something which can be marketed. I think that's, you know, I completely, you know, I think what you've advocated on this front is something we've all really appreciated. My question, I suppose, is, you know, I understand when the front line is real front lines, but what about when the front line is housing in north of England, or you know, the real degradation of town centres or you know, in our own country, the blight of town centres which have been destroyed by shopping and that. I mean, how do we turn that into a front line?
Well, I think, I mean, first of all, whoever attempts to turn it into a front line must care passionately about those specific problems and their implications. And secondly, in terms of how it's done, I think this comes down to design and architectural practice. And you talked about opening up and widening, and literally opening up and widening that practice. So one example would be there is a brilliantly idiosyncratic British designer who is obsessed by social housing, has never wanted to design anything else, Peter Barber. And he has come up with incredibly imaginative, inventive solutions. He's never worked with big budgets. He often works with charities, but he has also found a couple of genial and empathic commercial property developers who will work with him, and he's convinced them that by putting thought, imagination, and sensitivity into new social housing projects, he can actually make them more profitable for them, simply by using space more intelligently, he said, is one of the key things, than conventional approaches would do. So that is sort of the old-fashioned, traditional sort of design obsessive who happens to have identified a really important issue. But you can then look at all the other organizations that describe themselves as being design agencies. Forensic architecture would be a classic example of this, who are applying design in a far less conventional way, but are doing so always in collaboration with specialists from relevant disciplines. And I think that is increasingly going to happen. So one of the pioneers of this approach is a fantastic woman, a British social designer, Hilary Cottam. And she was a development economist. She worked for the World Bank for several years and sort of discovered design by accident then, because she was put in charge of installing new irrigation projects in southern Africa for the World Bank. And she couldn't work out why, with sort of similar construction techniques, their success or failure varied, and, you know, just the reliability of the project varied enormously. And so she investigated it, and it came down to the quality of their design. And so she returned to the UK and decided that she wanted to experiment with ways of redesigning social services. And she's incredibly charismatic as well as imaginative and intelligent. So she raised a lot of money for this from the public sector, the private sector, too, and also from non-profit funders. And so she did a pilot project in Southwark, which is one of the most economically deprived boroughs of South London. It was specifically to look at the provision of care for the elderly, because Southwark Council had approached her and said, we're spending a fortune on this. We know that we're wasting a lot of the money, but we don't know why, and we don't know how to reallocate it. So Hilary assembled cross-disciplinary teams of specialists, but she called the teams design teams, and there was always a traditionally trained designer in charge of each team. And they went to interview elderly people all over Southwark to find out what was working about the current provision of services for them and what wasn't. And she put the designers in charge of each team. So, you know, this could be statisticians, social scientists, economists like herself, whoever. And she insisted that they adhered to the design process and they spoke design language. And she did it because she, as an outsider to design, genuinely believed that it wielded a higher quality solution. She felt that designers, without even knowing it, through their training, generally for different specialist areas of design, tend to be very good at communicating. So they were great at sort of teasing information out of the elderly people that they may have felt more reticent of sharing. And that also, when it came to developing new ideas to be prototyped, they tended to be much looser and more imaginative in their thinking. So in other words, she chose design as the fundamental staple of her work, and she then applied it to all sorts of other social problems, and with very positive effects. And her idea was never that Participle, which was her the agency she'd set up, should run these projects forever, but that they'd set them up and then hand them over to the local community. So I follow several of the local communities on Instagram, and they're always hiking in the Lake District, doing deals for cheap ice creams or cinema tickets, or, helping one. The idea is, rather than being passive recipients of support, they're contributing. Someone might advise someone on accountancy, another might teach a recently widowed person to cook, whatever. And she is now, so she has been extremely influential through this work. She's written a couple of books about it, which are excellent. But she is now working for the government in the UK. She's just completed a report into uplands. So in other words, we don't really have mountains in Britain, but hilly regions, very remote rural regions, which are areas of deep deprivation in the UK, and what can be done to reinvigorate them, and is now about to start, you'll be happy to hear, a research project on housing. So these are very pragmatic ways of intervening, with design at the centre, but always working collaboratively with other disciplines.
And cross-disciplinary.
Yes.
And I think that's what's very interesting about that model, and I would say that's a very different attitude, no? And I think...
Yeah, and forensic architecture is the same.
Yeah, and I think in planning, we're still stuck with the conventional categorization of responsibilities. So we have traffic planners, and we have urban planners, and but what you're talking about in this example is looking at from an economic position, and looking at it a much more three-dimensional approach to the problem, going back one step, because that's what our experience is. You can't solve those problems with conventional methods or responsibilities. The issues of environment and territory take us way outside of the conventional structures. You have to look at it from a social and economic, and therefore you need experts to do that. And as designers, we're not experts, but what you're saying is we are quite good at recognizing experts, and we're quite good at knowing what to do with them.
Yes, and actually, this is Hilary. I mean, she's been out at the front line and in the field, observing all these projects and contributing to them, that designers are good at getting the best out of the experts. So it also means the designers are better informed, and hopefully their design proposals will be better informed too. And the experts will excel in their own field, but have the opportunity to collaborate with people from other disciplines too. I mean, it's not a sort of original modern movement, 20th century way of thinking about these things. So it was something Laszlo Moholy-Nagy was advocating all those decades ago. But I think it's fascinating that so many of these projects are coming together. Critically, they need people in power who probably still do believe that design's all about snazzy trainers to believe in them and back them.
But in that case, it was an administration who asked for help. They identified sheltered housing. Was sheltered housing for old people?
No, that their entire provision of social services for elderly people, this would be everything from Meals on Wheels to nursing care in the home. They were giving standardized packages to everyone. And in fact, so a lot of those services were being wasted on people who didn't need them, and people who did need them maybe needed more.
So it depended on that administration recognizing that this was a sort of design problem.
Well, less a design problem, that design could take the lead in providing a really imaginative,
to use design in
exactly imaginative
the system
solution.
had to be redesigned.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the difficulties in the whole design discussion, because clearly we still have objects in mind when it comes to design. So there's two ways, the word design has become a slightly stretched description.
It has become a stretched description. I used to worry about that, but the conclusion I came to was that if the application of the design process or design strategies is going to make a positive difference, so what if it's stretching the meaning of the word? I mean, the critical thing, as I said at the end of my preamble, is that designers accept that with greater power and greater ambition comes greater responsibility, and so the consequences of failure are horrific, or could be horrific. So they have to approach things with absolute rigor and specificity.
And do you think that the scale of these issues, in a way, makes the answering of them or the addressing of them overshadow the sort of conventional notion of design? I mean, where does conventional design sit? I mean, if the emergencies that we have are environmental and social, in terms of social inequality and lack of housing and lack of security, and does that overwhelm notions of worrying about designing a teapot or designing a house? I mean, are we now thinking about housing not just in terms of how it looks from the outside, but how we deliver it and what its recyclability is and its efficiency to build? I mean, where do our conventional evaluations, aesthetic evaluations or evaluations of beauty, sit within this much more, dramatic role that designers might be playing?
Well, first of all, I think housing is an area that has been identified as an emergency all over the world. And architects like Peter Barber, who, as I said, is a very traditional architect, he has made it his focus of his work. It's his crusade, and he addresses it like that. And obviously, he has to negotiate his way through it.
He's brilliant, by the way. If you have the opportunity, look at his work. Peter Barber, what he's doing as a one-man show in a sort of guerrilla warfare way. But the reality is that housing is talked about so much, and and there's a few others, but the reality is we're not getting our hands around the issue of housing anywhere.
Well, but that's all the more reason to try rather than to give up. So another amazing example would be Yasmin Lari, who is, she's in her 80s. She was she was the first woman to be licensed to practice architecture in Pakistan. And she became a starchitect in Pakistan during the 1980s, made a lot of money. All her buildings were very shiny and glossy and stylish. But she then became passionate about applying her time and energy instead to identifying ways of preserving Pakistan's historic architectural heritage that was being either abandoned or demolished all over the country. So set up a foundation to do that. But after a number of horrific floods in Pakistan that killed hundreds of thousands of people and destroyed the homes of several million people, she decided that that was going to be her major crusade. So she puts together teams of what she calls barefoot architects, designers, and engineers, and she set them a challenge to design and build 1 million homes across Pakistan. This was 4 years ago, and so her aim was that the millionth home should be built in 2025. And I interviewed Yasmin for Design Emergency because I had always been fascinated by her, and she was both as charismatic and as terrifying as I had expected. And at the time, I think they only had 18 months to go before their target, and they'd built 330,000 homes in Pakistan. I mean, they're fairly simple homes, but they're, flood resistant and so on. They've been very thoughtfully designed. And that in itself is an unbelievable achievement. But in October last year, the millionth home was built. Now, that's the kind of challenge you would never think anyone could realize, but she pulled it off.
Because she was able to describe it as an emergency. Why can't we describe it in the UK as an emergency?
I think we have incredible housing charities in the UK. I think everybody's aware that there's a housing crisis and a homelessness crisis. And I mean, there are so many complex issues around planning, the economy of housing in the UK. You're right, it needs radical, perhaps Hillary should assemble a task force.
It sounds like it. Just before we open it up, and you started talking about, heritage and things. Where do you think craft sits in this whole discussion? I mean, I've talked about, the sort of hardware issue of design and beauty, and you refer often to the idea of traditional workmanship, the making of things, craftsmanship. Where does that now sit within this new perspective?
Well, there is a whole chapter of Design as an Attitude devoted to craft, because design and craft tended to be almost like enemies for years and years and years and years, both mutually despising the other for different reasons. And that has changed dramatically. And there's much wider interest in craft these days among the general public, and also within design. And some of the most interesting young designers they would describe themselves as industrial designers, in some cases tech designers, but their work is very focused on imbuing their work with narrative by using traditional craft techniques, whether it's the fabrication of materials, a craft aesthetic, or whatever, to give meaning to objects, so people will care for them more, they'll look after them, they'll last longer. So I'm talking about people like Nifemi Marcus Bello, the Nigerian designer who operates from Lagos, always using local artisans, local light industrial units, local materials and traditional artisanal methods, or Fernand Lapos, who works in Mexico, and he embeds himself in rural communities to learn about their traditional techniques and also how to use what's conventionally considered to be waste products, but to use them in a meaningful way. And I was lucky enough, Evelyn took me around the wonderful anthropological museum here today, and it was just extraordinary. I spent quite a lot of my childhood on a farm which my great-grandparents owned in Yorkshire, in northern England. So I was introduced at a very young age to how important it is, how rural communities with very high levels of poverty, very few resources, can be so imaginative and creative in a very pragmatic way. And I'd always admired and loved that aspect of life in Yorkshire. So it was wonderful to see just the brilliance, really, of the people who'd made the tools, the pots, the machines, everything. Quite extraordinary.
Questions for Alice?
Or David?
No, for Alice.
Well, while you're thinking of questions, I've got one for you, David, and it has obviously, Galicia has been a hugely important part of your life and your family's life for many, many years, and you've become much more embedded in it in recent years through the work at the foundation. How have the sort of lessons you've learnt here, how have they affected the other side of your work, which is the very successful conventional architectural practice that you've built up?
We're not sure yet, because it goes back to the points that you were making, that conventional practice frames how you can operate, and in a rather rigid way. It keeps you within quite tight boundaries. Which in the past has never really been such a big problem. And we might complain that we're stuck within those boundaries, but 20 years ago it was never. And if you were lucky, like I was, those boundaries could be quite nice. Doing a museum here or doing a nice house there. The landscape has changed now. The landscape within which we operate doesn't allow us just to think, well, I do a nice building, because the relevance of that is questioned by the way it fits in to the bigger problems. And maybe not on a one-by-one case, but certainly in your overall performance as a professional person has been. So the foundation has allowed us not just to shift, but just to change totally the way we operate, much more in the way you were explaining before, that we try to work outside of the boundaries, look at cross-disciplinary work. I mean, that's the work we enjoy a lot, is cross-disciplinary. How does it feed back into to practice? Not sure. I mean, it's a sort of slow influence, and certainly I think it's through the commitment of the foundation team, who are all architects and mostly architects, and all are willing to see work as not just concluded in an object, but maybe concluded in other ways, less visible, because that's one of the problems, that we're very rewarded by making something and seeing it and standing there. I mean, it's very difficult to compensate for that, because it is wonderful to make something and see it completed. If you're working in environmental issues or social issues, there isn't that completion. It's always work in progress. It's always, it's often about not doing things or stopping things happening. I mean, one of the things that we end up having to do in the foundation is stop, think about how to stop things happening. So I'm not sure, but I think it's the same issue that I think and I absolutely would not want to believe that the pursuit of beauty through how we make our environment should be abandoned in the pursuit of these emergency conditions. So I think my generation especially is sort of trying to reconcile two parts of our brain.
But don't you feel that the concept and expectations of beauty has changed, in that it retains its aesthetic dimension, but also, if something is going to aggravate the climate emergency, how can it be beautiful? If it's going to be used in a sort of hideously destructive and damaging context, ditto. I think we've become much more sophisticated and much more sensitive in identifying what we confidently believe is beautiful.
That we evaluate it through different lens now than we would have ever. Come on, someone, ask a question. Okay, one here.
Cando estabades a falar sobre o tema de que o deseño, por un lado, resolve problemas, pero tamén pode abrir oportunidades, penso que en ese momento a min entroume tamén a curiosidade por saber se tamén podemos pensar que os diseñadores, eu, digamos, parto un pouco desa premisa ou quero, ou por donde eu estou enfocando o meu traballo de deseño, que tamén é por antepoñernos ou adiantarnos aos problemas para poder plantexar dunha forma, eu creo que máis eficaz, esas soluciones ou esas oportunidades, que está un pouco polo medio do que estabades a contar, non? O sea, porque o que te parece ámbito de deseño que trata sobre a especulación ou o futuro de deseño? Que eu creo que fala un pouco, ou está bastante relacionado co que plantexabas.
Thank you. It's a great question. Rather than describing it as speculative design, I prefer to describe it as anticipatory design, and I think this is an incredibly important role of design. Obviously, one of the massive design debates of the moment concerns artificial intelligence, and however terrifying some of the implications of artificial intelligence are, I mean, culminating 2 weeks ago in one program being withdrawn because the full implications of it in terms of enabling criminals to hack systems were too dangerous to contemplate. The one thing I find positive about the debate is that with most aspects of new technology, they tend to be analysed before they're actually applied, i.e. while they're being designed and developed, in terms of what they can do, the positive things they can bring to us. I think and that's very important. I think equally important is to anticipate the negatives they could bring. And time again, as a society, we've run into trouble because we haven't done that. So maybe it would have made no difference at all to the first wave of digital advances if designers had applied an anticipatory approach by trying to anticipate what deepfakes could do, how cybercrime could develop, the bullying and tormenting of young children, or indeed anyone, by cyberbullies. I mean, all these terrible problems that the first wave of digital technology has created tended not to be discussed in advance. So I think the one positive for me of artificial intelligence is that we are all very aware that it could bring huge potential negatives to our lives as well as positives. And an enormous amount of time, effort, and energy is being invested in anticipating what those negatives will be. And I think that's a very important role for designers that could be increasingly productive in the future.
Mais alá da tecnoloxía, que sí, estou de acordo co plantexamento e sobre todo do que está por vir, eu tamén pensaba, ou realmente pensaba, no mundo analóxico, non só no tecnoloxía. Por exemplo, un exemplo que salía que é o cambio climático ou, en este caso, máis cercano, dos incendios. Como podemos traballar o deseño para previr antes de, o sea, como podemos tamén, bueno, creo que vai un pouco por este pensamento dos diseñadores en que pensamos sempre exclusivamente en nós e non tanto en outros habitantes cos que compartimos, como pode ser a natureza, os animais, etcétera, etcétera. Ou máis por aí.
Well, it's a very interesting point. But I do think there has been a big design focus on this. And this predated the fires in Pacific Palisades in Los Angeles, the terrible fires a year or so ago that caused so much mass destruction. And there already have been huge advances in simply by people, generally not designers, geologists or meteorologists, who are researching the causes of forest fires, why the fire is spreading so quickly, what can happen in terms of, and this comes straight back to conventional architecture, future building regulations. They're immediately, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, abolished all building restrictions immediately after the forest fires in order to accelerate the speed of construction in buildings. I thought that was bonkers, because surely this was an amazing opportunity to identify how to change the design of housing so it can be more fireproof in future, given that tragically these fires are going to resurface. So I think there's a huge potential role for design there, and there is a lot of interesting work being done in it already.
I think there's always an issue, though, about where do these tools get used and how are they used, in whose hands are they? You gave the example of the drone, and you were advocating, what a great thing the drone was because it was protecting the Ukrainians. But what happens when and if the Russians developed a better one and it destroys more Ukrainians? So actually, in that case, we've invented a tool better at killing people, We're just saying at the moment they're killing more people on the side that we don't like. But the danger is we've unleashed something which can do more damage.
We have, but that would have been unleashed anyway, David. And the issue is that because Ukraine, there's actually a brilliant essay about the future of modern warfare in this week's edition of The Economist, and its argument is that without the Ukrainian R&D into drone technology, because they were outgunned by the Russians, you know, who had outmanned the pool of potential troops open to Putin was something like 10 times to Ukraine. It gave Ukraine a fighting chance of winning. I wouldn't normally use weapons as an example, but I think it's such a sort of compelling and convincing example in that particular area.
But it's not an innocent object.
It's not an innocent object at all. But actually, weirdly, the only reason why the Ukrainians had the infrastructure, the talent, the skills, the knowledge to have forged ahead with drone technology was because for decades, Ukrainians were educated by the excellent Russian maths and scientific education system. So unwittingly, the Russians were training the Ukrainians to avoid recolonization.
This is the development through design of technology, which is opening up other moral problems and challenges. Because now, that's a good use of the drone. But what about Trump killing people in boats off of the South American coast? Someone sitting in a room who can just kill people without any interaction whatsoever. So the danger of technology is if the technology gets too far away from us, when it's in your hand and it's a way of cutting corn, it's a tool which has clear purpose. When we're moving into developing technologies where the scale has changed, it's no longer in our individual realm. We are surrendering ourselves. This seems to me a threshold that we're moving over now. We can all believe, going back to the forest fire, maybe the drones allow us, for instance, to monitor the forest. I mean, in a way, we should be able to now survey the Galician forest in a way maybe we couldn't before, let's say. So, drone good. But we also, that means that we want to do things in the common good, and we rely on people to act in the common good. I would say 20 years ago, or 15 years, maybe 10 years ago, I would have much more optimism about this, but what we've seen in the last few years has been people acting not in our best interest and using these technologies and using these methods of monitoring. So the same things which you can see being useful against bad things, I guess, are just as useful for people doing bad things.
Potentially. I mean, it's a moral argument that goes both ways. Without drones, Ukraine would now be part of Russia. They would undeniably have continued to conquer more and more parts of Ukraine, because we are personally sympathetic to the Ukrainians rather than to Vladimir Putin. The Ukrainians use their design expertise because they were desperate. I mean, it would be a design project no one would ever want to need to tackle because the implications of it are so dire. So I absolutely take your point. But the economist's argument is that it's only because of drone technology that small countries now literally do have a fighting chance of avoiding being annexed immediately by larger powers.
Hola, buenas tardes. Perdón por no saber inglés y no poder expresarme en inglés. Lo que iba a comentar se ha ido un poco por las ramas con tanta guerra, tanto dron y tanto problema, pero bueno, yo quería volver un poco a lo de antes. La definición entre lo que se ha entendido siempre por diseño y lo que venimos a hablar en el libro, por ejemplo, de diseño social, ¿no? Yo creo que esta casa es un poco reflejo de todo eso. Arriba están David y los arquitectos con su estudio diseñando cosas muy concretas, respondiendo a problemas muy concretos que él no los ha estudiado, sino que generalmente se los han dado. Y en la planta segunda tenemos a la Fundación RIA, que lo que hace es un poco de lo que se trata el diseño social. Es diseñar proyectos y diseñar estrategias y diseñar protocolos. Para ello, se tiene en cuenta la realidad, se hacen muchas reuniones, se tiene en cuenta la realidad de lo que dice la gente que se dedica en el agro, en temas forestales, en temas de sostenibilidad, y luego entre todos apuntan unas posibilidades. No sé, en definitiva, en qué concluirán. Normalmente en diseño social se hacen estas cosas y al final, si hay que diseñar algún producto, se diseña algún producto. Como usted decía, hay gente dedicada al diseño en la cabeza de todo este elemento, pero hay gentes pensantes de muchas profesiones, incluso en temas de ancianos y demás. La gente de los geriatras opinan muchísimo antes de establecer ese protocolo y esa estrategia, ¿no? Entonces, yo quería apuntar eso. Y luego, segundo, sí quería preguntar, entre ese diseño social, no el que empezó a pergeñarse como diseño social cuando en la Bauhaus o en Chicago, sino lo que ahora se conoce como diseño social, que son trabajos de gentes que lo que están es haciendo estas historias, ¿no? Es captar un problema existente, analizar ese problema, estudiarlo con toda la comunidad y con gente experta y dar una solución. ¿Y qué diferencia hay entre eso, entre diseño social y el diseño como actitud? El diseño actitudinal. ¿El diseño actitudinal es una cosa personal o es también una cosa de un equipo comunitario?
It's an excellent question. I mean, first of all, I think both the scenarios you described to are part of the rapidly expanding movement of social design. And design as an attitude was a quote from Laszlo Molinage, who I admire hugely. And what he was saying was that design could be, but need not necessarily be, a purely commercial discipline of a designer responding to a set brief from a client and executing it according to instruction. And so, in other words, it can become a much more fluid and expansive discipline, which also involved forging collaborations with people from other sectors, but other sectors increasingly intervening in design. So the doctors and Serhat Kahani would be a good example of that. And I felt, as the title of a book, it was an appealing way of describing this new movement, this opening up of design, which doesn't mean that traditional design disciplines and traditional design practices will suddenly become redundant. It just opens up many different opportunities and the possibility of being much more improvisational in design. I mean, interestingly, in terms of design being perceived as increasingly important and useful by other disciplines, one example is legal design, which I had never heard of until a podcast called Legal Design invited me to be interviewed for it, because it's basically groups of lawyers who feel that many different aspects of the legal process are poorly designed, that they should be fitter for purpose by being redesigned. And so they use the conventional design practice, design principles, to analyze legal issues, to find more imaginative solutions. And I found that really interesting, because the more I thought about it, there are so many aspects of the legal system that really could benefit from the sort of analysis an imagination that design can bring to problems like that. But I would never have expected in a million years groups of lawyers to have come together globally to form this network of legal designers.
I think... Okay, last one. Very last one. Evelyn, you can ask yours later.
Thank you for such a wonderful conversation and lecture. I just wanted to say that in terms of design intelligence, just to close the Russia-Ukrainian question, which is such a complex one, we tend to think that quote-unquote responses or solutions need to be technological. But in that case, I would argue, wouldn't it have been wiser to find, a policy-related diplomatic solution, like not having Ukraine join the OTAN? You know what I mean? I feel that sometimes definitely the intelligent design responses are not technological.
I mean, not having war would be better than
Exactly.
having better ways of having war.
It was very easy to avoid that war.
Absolutely.
That's how I feel about it. It was extremely easy.
It would,
to
but
avoid
obviously
it.
that wasn't the Ukraine's fault. It was Putin's. And for political reasons, like Netanyahu, and Trump, they're all stuck in these horrible conflicts that they caused, and they now can't extricate themselves from.
And they could have been avoided, yeah.
Ideally, with better leadership, yes.
Yes, and yes, sometimes our solutions need to go in that direction versus the direction of better technologies to kill. That was just something I wanted to comment.
So is the technology prolonging our problems instead of... I think, talking about prolonging, I think we have to terminate our evening. I want to thank all of you for coming. Alice, of course, especially, thank you so much for bringing these thoughts to us. I think, for me, the most important things amongst everything you say, I think this idea of interdisciplinary problem solving or question ask. First of all, what we talk about in the foundation is asking the right questions and formulating those questions and using experts. And I think, as you would say, architects and designers have a strong role there. I think we see where it might go. I'm not sure politicians always know where it might go. I think we as architects and designers and planners have a sort of focus, and we know. And I think that is about beauty. I think it is about believing in the beauty of the world that we live in. And I think that the environmental crisis that we have does force us to think in different ways. But in the end, our reference is nature, and our reference of beauty is always a reference to nature. We've always been inspired, even in our most artificial constructions, by the rules of nature. So I think looking after the environment doesn't necessarily bring us away from these conventional passions and enthusiasms that the design community has always held, or the artistic community, Alvaro. So thank you all for coming. Alice, thank you so much.